Hi guys, today I'll be talking about Keith Haring's artwork known as Ignorance Equals Fear, and you can see it on the screen. And yeah, I'll be talking about it, and I'll be talking about its connection to the AIDS epidemic in America. So um, this poster was made to protest the way the AIDS epidemic had been treated by the American government. And if he's protesting this, obviously it's very significant. So I'll just give you a bit of a background on AIDS. So AIDS is basically it's a more severe version of HIV, and HIV is a disease that destroys the immune system, in particular CD4 cells, which are a type of white blood cell that triggers your immune system. And eventually, with HIV, so many CD4 cells can be destroyed that you cannot fight any infections, you cannot fight any diseases, and that is when HIV becomes AIDS, when your immune system has basically become incapacitated. And it spreads through body fluids such as blood, semen, vaginal and anal fluids, and breast milk. And it's mostly contracted through unprotected sex, needle use, mostly for drugs, because that's usually the situation where dirty needles would be used, and birth as well. If the mother of a child has AIDS and has AIDS while she's pregnant with the child, then it can be passed down. And it arrived in the US in 1970, but it wasn't brought to public attention until around 1988. The earliest medical report about AIDS was published in 1981 by the Centers for Disease and Prevention. It was around that time, 5 gay men had all died from pneumocystis pneumonia, an infection that only occurs in people with weak immune systems. So we already see these hints that AIDS has something to do with the immune system. And it started getting mainstream attention in 1982 when the New York Times published an article about the mysterious new disease, which by then had infected 335 people, taking the life of 136 of them. And since it mostly affected gay men, it was known as the gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. But by the end of 1982, its name was changed to AIDS. And despite the name change, the first name of AIDS would follow it for decades. And even though scientists found out that AIDS was not only spread amongst gays in 1983, people believed that it was a gay-only disease years past that date. Some even went so far as to claim that AIDS was a punishment for the sin of homosexuality. That really affected the public's views on the disease, and it affected how the government treated it, this stigma around it, and this connection between AIDS and homosexuality. In 1984, that was when researchers were first able to connect AIDS with HIV. So we can see the beginning of medical advances to treat AIDS. In 1985, the first commercial HIV tests were released, and gay men were banned from donating blood. And in 1987, the first antiretroviral medication for AIDS was released. It's called azithromycin, or AZT, which is, I can't really pronounce these scientific words very well. At the time, during the 1980s, when the disease first popped up, I mentioned before that the fact that it was related to, it was mostly gay men that had the disease, that really affected public perception of the disease and people that had the disease. And it led to people sort of not really not really caring about it, in the sense that they were trying to figure out ways to prevent the disease and trying to figure out how to treat the disease. And in the Reagan administration's response to the AIDS epidemic was quite shocking. There's an interview between Larry Speakes, the press secretary of Ronald Reagan, and a journalist, Lester Kinsolving. And when Kinsolving brought up the fact that a lot of people had died from AIDS, or at this point, it was called AIDS at this point, Larry Speakes was just laughing about it and saying, oh, well, I certainly don't have it, which shows how the government didn't really take it seriously. They didn't really care about it as a threat to national health, most likely because it only affected, not only affected, but it mostly affected gay men. In 1985, the first plan for the prevention of AIDS was in the US was developed. It was rejected within the same year by Washington leaders. They told the AIDS Prevention Task Force that they should look pretty and do as little as they could. And by the end of 1985, in the US, there were 8,406 new victims, and it brought the total victims of AIDS in the US to 16,458 people. So this very blasé attitude towards the disease, it just shows how little the government cared about this issue and how little they really wanted to do anything to stop it, which shows, I think in my opinion, that shows that they are unfit to lead, because if you're leading a country, the health and safety of your citizens should be the number one priority, your number one priority, and it doesn't matter if they're gay, straight, or if what they're suffering from. That should be something that you care about. And media coverage of the disease very often tried to demonize it and pose it, like I said earlier, pose it as a punishment for the sin of homosexuality. So a lot of gay people within the community, a lot of people within the gay community, as this was the community that was being affected most, were protesting the treatment of AIDS and demanding that the government actually do something to try to protect people with AIDS and try to prevent the spread of the disease. So there were a lot of like marches and articles and art, which we're going to be talking about today with this artwork that this poster that I introduced earlier by Keith Haring. Keith Haring was born on May 4th in 1958, and he was an American pop artist and activist, and one of the main issues that he protested against was the AIDS epidemic. And he himself had AIDS, and he died from AIDS in the 16th of February, 1990. And his style is quite recognizable. Like, I think if you see anything he's done, you can see it and you can think, okay, this is Keith Haring. But it includes a lot of lines and figures, which you can see here in this work. It's focusing mainly, like, there are these people and there's a lot of lines, like showing movement and stuff like that. And this particular work is called Ignorance Equals Fear, and it was made in 1989. And you can see in the bottom right corner it says, "Fight AIDS, Act Up." And there's a lot going on in in this poster, so you can see the see not, hear not, speak not, which I believe is a reference to the fact that the government just ignored the AIDS epidemic. And at the top, you can see ignorance equals fear. And there was a lot of misinformation that was spread around about AIDS, that it only happens to, it can only be contracted by gay people, and that it's contagious through like contact, which is not the case, and it was highly stigmatized. So the lack of information that people had about it made it very easy for people to fear and demonize people that had AIDS, and it can also and that lack of knowledge, it also causes fear for people that had AIDS because there was like such little helpful information available. So that must have been incredibly scary. And then at the bottom it says silence equals death. The government, as I've said many times before, but this was a massive issue. This was one of the like really big problems with the AIDS epidemic in America and in many other places in the world, is that the government just ignored the AIDS epidemic, and they allowed it to get really, really bad, and it caused a lot of death, and it caused a lot of pain, and it caused a lot of fear. And next to the silence equals death, there's a pink triangle, and it's a sign of queer empowerment. It's not really used as much anymore, but it was in back in like the late 80s, which is when this piece was made. And it was originally a sign that Nazis used to identify homosexuals in concentration camps, but it was reclaimed by the queer community and made into a symbol of empowerment. So you can see there it's evoking the community and sort of saying like, we need to like come together and rise against this. And it says, fight AIDS, act up. And that's a clear call to action. And the pink targets, it shows how people with AIDS were targeted by media and like mass fear. And the X's, the color of the X's, being pink, it calls back to the pink triangle, calls back to queerness, showing how there was a lot of homophobia mixed with the fear about AIDS. And then there are a lot of movement lines. So it shows that while the government was silent on the issue, there was still a lot of movement around the disease. Like, there was a lot of protesting against the discrimination of those with AIDS, and the media also like demonized, stigmatized, and spread misinformation about AIDS. So it does show, while there is like widespread silence, there's also a lot happening around the issue. And then there's a red background that could represent fear and anger, or alarm, fear towards people with AIDS, fear of people with AIDS, anger of people with AIDS, of how they're being treated, alarm. Obviously, anytime there's an epidemic, it's very scary. So, yeah, that is what I got from that's what I got from the poster. But obviously, with all art, there's a lot to pick up on and interpret. So I'm sure I missed something. So I think you guys should like take a look at it yourself and just do your own research and come to your own conclusions. But this is what I think of this art, and I hope you learned something today. Bye.